Welcome back to our Python Basics series. Today, we're talking about functions and methods. This will really go a long way in keeping your code neat as well as organized, so let's take a look at how we use them. Let's start by looking at what a function is. A function is a group of code that you have to call to run. Throughout the series, we have been utilizing all sorts of built-in functions. These are the ones that come included with the rich standard library of Python. For example, the print function is a built-in function. Check out the description if you want a full list of Python's built-in functions. Today, we are going to be looking at user-defined functions. This is for when you want to define and use your own functions within your code. This is a great tool for when we don't want to repeat code. We're going to elaborate on methods in our episode on classes. For now, just know that methods are very similar to functions. Methods are associated with an object, so they vary slightly, but they achieve the same purpose. I will include a link in the description explaining the difference between a function and a method. For this episode, we're going to mainly focus on the basics for creating a user-defined function. We're going to start by creating a basic function that will print our full name when it's called. To do this, first we have to identify the function by saying def and then naming our function. In this case, we'll name it name. We then add a colon, and then within the function, we give the code that we want the function to execute. For this one, we'll have it print my first name as well as my last name. Now that we have a function created, we can come down and call it. To do this, we simply type in name and then an open and close parentheses. As you can see in line 1, we named our function name. So when we call it in line 5, we provide name with the open and close parentheses. When we run this, you'll see that it prints out Mitchell Gottlieb. Every time this function gets called, it executes the code within it. To demonstrate this, we can do name and name 2 more times. Now when we run it, you'll see that it prints my name 3 times because we called the function 3 times in a row. Now let's make this dynamic by using something called arguments. Often you may hear these called parameters. These are information that are passed into a function. You can give a function whatever data type you'd like. Rather than having our function only print out my name, let's give the function arguments so that we can pass in whatever we want it to output. In line 1, we defined our function name, and within the parentheses, we can give it arguments. We'll give it 2 arguments for now, first and last. Within our code, let's print out the first and the last now. Our function is no longer printing just my name, it's going to print the first and last name of whatever arguments are passed in. Let's go ahead and call our function again, but this time pass in the arguments that we said it requires. To do this, let's call the function name and then pass in the first and set it equal to my first name. And then we'll pass in the last and set it equal to my last name. You'll notice that I separated the 2 arguments with a comma. Let's come down and do the same thing, but give it a different first name. We'll say John, and then we'll give it a different last name and say Doe. When we run this, you'll see that it prints out my name and then it prints out John Doe. You'll notice that we're using the exact same function to print out our first and last names. However, because the arguments are different, they provide different outputs. So currently in our example, the arguments are all required. It will not allow you to call the function unless values are provided for the arguments first and last. However, we do have the ability to set optional arguments. This is known as assigning a default parameter value. This means that if we call the function without the argument, it uses the default value. These should be placed last when defining a function. For example, let's modify the function that we have now to allow for an optional argument for a suffix. To do this, we'll come up to our definition of our function and we'll add a new argument named suffix and set it equal to a blank. What this means is if a suffix isn't provided, it'll be blank. We can modify the code within our function to also print out the suffix. So now it'll print our first name, last name, and the suffix. Looking at our 2 examples, I don't have a suffix in my name. However, John Doe is John Doe III. What we can do is come down into John Doe and add the argument suffix and set that equal to the third. When this code is ran, you can see that it just prints out my first name and my last name, but suffix defaults to blank because I didn't provide a suffix. However, with John Doe, we did provide a suffix and it was the third. Since a value was provided for this argument, you'll see that it does print out John Doe the third. The last thing that we're going to discuss in this episode is returns. As of now, the function simply prints out the name when we run it. However, we can make functions return a value as well. Let's come up in our code and replace this print statement. Rather than combining the name and printing that out, let's create a variable named full name. We'll go ahead and use the .join method and combine the first name, the last name, and the suffix. As a reminder, what this is doing is it's taking the first, last, and suffix and putting them into a list and then joining them on a space. That is then being saved to the variable full name. Now what we can do is come down a line and using all lowercase, we can say return and say full name. Now when this function is called, we provide the arguments first, last, and optionally suffix, and that joins it and then assigns it to the variable full name. That variable, which is a string data type, is then returned from the function. To show how this works, let's go ahead and remove our previous two examples. What we'll do is create a variable named myName. We can set that equal to us calling the named function, and we can pass in my first name, which is Mitchell, and then my last name, which is Gottlieb. Since we're calling the function we just created, we know that it's returning my full name string. That string is now being assigned to the variable myName. This means we can come down a line and print out myName. If we were to run this, you'll see that it prints out Mitchell Gottlieb. Now let's put everything we learned together and create a new function that adds two numbers. We'll go ahead and delete everything we have. Let's start by creating the function. We'll say def and name it add. Then we'll give it two arguments, x and y, that both default to 0. We'll say x equals 0, comma, y equals 0. We'll then use our colon and then come down, and within the function, we'll just return x plus y. We'll make this a little bit easier for you to see. Now let's come down and look at a couple of examples of us calling our function. First, let's just call add and not give it any parameters. Since both x and y default to 0, this one's going to return 0. Now let's call it by saying add where x equals 1 and y equals 2. This is going to return x plus y, which is 3. One thing to know is that you're not required to say x equals and y equals when passing in arguments. Another way of writing this would be add 1, comma 2. This would assume that x is 1 and y is 2 and return 3. Another way of calling this is saying add and we can say x equals 1 but not provide a y value. Since y has a default value, if x is 1 and y defaults to 0, 1 plus 0 returns 1. The same logic applies if we only defined y. In this case, x would default to 0, y would be set to 1, 0 plus 1 is 1. With these examples, we can go ahead and print out what each one's returning by saying print and then closing our parentheses. If we were to run this, you'll see that it prints out every single value. This is a good starting point for functions and methods. We will continue learning about these in the future. When you program, if you find yourself utilizing the same code multiple times, it may make sense to organize your code using a function. In our next episode, we're talking about if, elif, and else statements. Thank you for watching, and please like, comment, share, and subscribe.